Alright, so today we are putting a Ford Performance diff cover on the Raptor, and we're going to use a LubeLocker gasket to actually seal it up. I got this idea from the forums, from Ford Raptor forums. One of the members had mentioned that the paper gasket that comes with the Ford Performance diff cover is not the best. So I did decide to purchase the LubeLocker one and get working on that. The first thing that I did was make sure to level out the truck. I can't actually fit the truck in my garage, so I left it mostly in the driveway and put some 2x4 pieces underneath the front wheels to level it out. Now, in order to have enough space to actually get the diff cover off, you do need to remove the spare tire if you have it underneath the vehicle. I have owned two other trucks before this, and I've never actually pulled the spare off, so it was a little interesting for me to actually use that tool and understand exactly how to get it out of there. The tool comes in all these little sections, and you basically just click them together. I was pretty surprised that it was built decently. I kind of thought that this would be an afterthought for most manufacturers, but it doesn't seem that terrible. The hole that you actually put it into on the bumper is locked. I guess, to prevent people from stealing your spare tire. It's kind of a crappy lock. I feel like you could just pry it right off, but you do need to use your key, like the actual mechanical key, to pull it out. I have a cover on my key fob, so I had to pull the key ring off and then pull the key out and then pull the actual mechanical key out of there and use that to unlock that portion. There is a little funnel just past the bumper that guides the tool into the device that raises and lowers the spare tire. So you just gotta throw it in there. Once you get it all the way in, you'll feel it kind of click into place, and then you can use the tire iron portion to actually rotate the tire and get it down on the ground. So the tire is pretty heavy, which makes it difficult to lift it while you're lying on the ground and then try to figure out which hand to use to remove the suspension cable from inside of the wheel. It took a second to look at the suspension mechanism and how it was mounted in the rear. I was thinking that if I was able to get 37s on the truck, and I did want to store the spare underneath the rear, I could possibly unbolt and then move that mechanism to the rear and put spacers on the bumper to make enough room. That way everything could actually clear the diff. Not sure if that would work. Obviously you wouldn't be able to swap the bumper out at that point for like a frame cut, because you're going to need the entire frame horn to actually put a spacer in there. But just a thought. So before working on this, I wanted to make myself a nice little work area. I got a pan underneath to make sure that if I don't get all the oil into the actual the drain pan, then I have something to catch it. Because I've made that mistake several times before, where I think that the drain pan's open and it's really closed, and then it overflows. So always good to have one of those to keep something underneath that. Also set up all my lights to make sure that I have enough light. I'm a fairly small dude. I'm 5'8", and fitting underneath the vehicle when it's on the ground wasn't too terrible since I moved the spare out of the way. I do recommend moving that the suspension cable all the way up, because I ended up having to move it up later when I didn't raise it all the way. If I remember correctly, this is a 13 millimeter socket that you're going to use on all of these bolts. There are several of them, and 3 of them have some sort of cables connected to them. Those do pull or pop right off, but you see that one actually has the brake line bracket attached to it, so you need to remove that, and that was, I think it was either 10 or 11 millimeter. The lines coming off of the bracket and going onto the axle are hard lines, so you do have to be careful not to bend them too much whenever you're pulling that bracket off. For these other cables that are connected to the bolts, I would use a rivet puller or rivet pry bar if you have one, or you can just pull them right off. It's not too difficult, but if you want to make sure that you don't mess up the wiring, you could use a little pry bar. Those 3 bolts that have the threaded portion on the exterior for all the wiring to connect to require a deep socket for you to pull them off. So you will need to have that deep socket 13 whenever you do this. However you decide to unbolt all these bolts on the diff, just make sure that you leave the top for last so that all of the fluid will drain out of the bottom properly. So after pulling the cover off, there were a couple things that I noted. The first thing is that the stock gasket that comes on the diff cover is metal and rubber. So it's kind of silly that the one that comes with the performance cover is paper. Thought that was a little weird. There also was a significant amount of rust on the surface of on the mating surface. I already kind of knew this was going to happen, and then I needed to grab like a Brillo pad. That took me the longest of this entire thing. I was kind of surprised whenever I did the initial cut of this video that it took me about 2 hours to do this whole thing. I thought it would be a lot quicker. And the majority of my time was spent with a Brillo pad trying to scrub off all this rust to make sure that the mating surface was prepped really well to accept a new gasket and diff cover. So I started with, I tried, I think, 3 different types of Brillo pads before eventually you'll see me just pull out some 400 grit sandpaper and use that. I did make sure to, whenever using the sandpaper, to keep everything lubricated. So I just kept dipping the sandpaper back in the oil and scrubbing everything off, making sure that you protect the internals as much as possible and you don't get any rust or anything crazy inside of there. This actually took so long that the DSLR battery died about halfway through my install. I had to charge it, take a break, and then get back at it. I was also pretty poopy faced about like all the work that it took to try and scrape it off. My arms were hurting, etc. So I was whining quite a bit about how much of a pain in the butt this was. It's difficult to see in the video, but even using the sandpaper, the milling process that they used on the rear diff, the mating surface was still uneven. You could still see the lines from wherever it was cut straight across. So not perfect, but I definitely wasn't going to try and grind it down and make it flat anyway. So the LubeLocker gasket is metal and some sort of rubber or silicone that they use on there, and it's in 3 layers, so you get good protection. And whenever you put it on there, it's very obvious which way it goes based on the diff. You can only go one way and have all the holes line up whenever you actually put it on there. As everyone always says, the new diff cover is significantly heavier than the old one. Just obviously because of what material it's made out of and how thick it is. So it is a little difficult to actually lift it up and hold it whenever you put it on there. But in the package, we do get new bolts for it also. I went ahead and grabbed some red thread locker because you could tell on the old bolts that was what was put on there previously, is specifically red thread locker. And really, you shouldn't have a reason to pull this thing back off once you put it on, because it has all of the holes for you to be able to drain the diff fluid and then refill it and do all of your servicing without actually removing the cover. I went ahead and started lining up all the bolts and installing them using the red thread locker. I did end up deciding during this process that I was going to hold on to the original bolts where all of the wiring connected that had the external threads on it. And the reason for that is because I did hold it up at one point. The new bolts are slightly longer to account for the additional thickness of the new cover, but I don't think that there's any reason to not use the old bolts with the threaded exterior, just because it wasn't a huge difference. I did run them through the new diff cover, and there were plenty of threads to gain the appropriate amount of connection that you need to hold that cover on there. I did not end up using a crisscross pattern or a star pattern whenever I was installing this. Whenever I get to torquing it, I will do that, but I don't do it whenever first throwing in these the bolts, because I'm really just putting them on kind of finger tight, even though I'm using the ratchet. Just making it tight enough to where it'll actually hold the cover on there, and then I go back and torque it down later. So here you see me grabbing the torque wrench to actually torque down all of the bolts. I'm a little embarrassed to say I didn't hold on to the paper that held the torque spec. There are instructions inside of the LubeLocker gasket container, and I want to say it was somewhere between 24 and 28 foot-pounds. So I set that on my torque wrench and then tried to do a crisscross pattern. I wish I would have drawn a diagram and numbered them to figure out the best way to do it, but there's so many bolts, I kind of went all over the place, and I was like, wait a minute, did I get all of those bolts? So I went back around just to verify and made sure that I was good to go. all of these little wire holders that go over top of the original bolts, they do fit on there. The one on the left, or on the driver's side, I did have to grab some snips and clip off a little bit of those holders. They were intended to keep it from rotating on the stock diff cover. So I ended up grabbing some snips, cutting those off, but everything else did just go right on there, and I didn't have any issues with that. So it will fit. I got a little stuck right here. The instructions for the diff cover didn't specifically say how to use these plugs that are on the diff cover. I didn't know if there was a torque value, or if, how exactly to use them. But basically there's what looks like thread locker around the edge, or if you can think of like plumber's tape, but for gas lines, some sort of sealant that will keep everything inside, and you don't actually have to torque it all the way down. In fact, I don't think you're supposed to. That way you can continue to reuse it, and then every time you'll just torque it down a little bit farther to make sure that that seal is still there. Unless you have some crazy like Fab Works 8-inch lift for the Raptor and have destroyed your vehicle, you will not need to use that top plug. If you've got a Raptor, you're probably going to always want to use that lower plug. The increased volume will not assist you at all. So right here I'm obviously trying to fit that last clip onto the bolt. And again, I just ended up having to clip or take some snips and actually cut off all of those little attachments that were on there to prevent it from getting in the way. Here we are, finally time to actually fill the diff. I did go with AMSOIL 75W90. I actually did a lot of research on this. I watched a ton of videos. I was scouring the forums. I read all kinds of things, and everybody had an opinion on what was best for the vehicle. I did decide that I was going to use AMSOIL just because it always gets rave reviews. But when it came down to when deciding the weight of the oil, I basically just went to my local auto parts store, and what they had in stock was within the values of what I was looking for. And it didn't bother me to get something a little heavier than stock, but not as heavy as a lot of people are running. So I just went with that. That's how I made the decision. I got a little excited about these AMSOIL bags. I thought they would be super convenient, and honestly, I mean, they are pretty convenient to actually get the oil in there. That way you don't have to use a pump, which is what I would traditionally use when replacing the diff fluid. The only inconvenience was the difficulty of taking off the seal that's under the cap. You end up, you have to cut it off essentially. There's no tabs to where you can peel it off or pull it off. You actually have to cut it out to use it. It did take about 3.5 bags to actually fill up the diff. So you need to buy 4 of them. before everything started pouring out. I wish I'd gone a little bit slower because I had to wait a second for it to get down to a little bit of a light dribble, and then I ended up putting the plug in there to close everything up. It was very important to me to get everything very dry and clean, because even though I had the LubeLocker gasket on there, obviously we're still concerned about leaks. We don't want any leaks. I am pretty much done at this point. I just need to clean everything up and put the spare back on. I decided to wipe the spare down, which is pretty pointless, honestly, because it just got dirty again the following weekend. But I did wipe it down. You'll notice that there's a line that runs perpendicular to the direction of the tire. That's from the safety wire that connects onto there. So if you tighten it up really tight, I guess you end up getting that line on the tire. I do not do 5-wheel tire rotations, but I do think it's a good idea. So next, since I had the tire off, I decided to use some metal protectant, also AMSOIL. Found out about this on the forums also. I used it on the rest of the vehicle and on the frame, but I haven't actually pulled off the tire to clean up underneath the tire and make sure that I get it coated all over the frame. This stuff will help make sure that your frame stays in good shape. You know, as long as you do keep using it and recoat before the winter seasons. It essentially creates a wax over top of all of the metal surfaces and helps salt and all kinds of nasty stuff from getting on the metal and causing it to rust. Of course, only use this on steel underbody components to stop rust. So the stuff that I'm using is called AMSOIL MPHD, or Metal Protectant Heavy Duty. Comes highly recommended, which is why I use it. And I haven't really had any issues on any of the areas that I've used it on, with the exception of the leaf springs. With the Icon leaf springs, I did pull them apart, coat it in this stuff, put them back together, but I imagine with all of the rubbing and the wear, I still end up getting some rusting between the leaf springs. So, a couple of extra notes. If you do plan on using MPHD in the future, make sure that you do it outside. Don't use it inside of your garage. The stuff reeks. It's a very strong smell. Obviously, any gear oil also has a very strong smell. So once you toss out you pull out either your old oil or you're about to toss out those little bags, get rid of it as soon as you can. Do not keep it in your vehicle for any reason, because the smell will linger in your fabrics inside of your vehicle for months. I have made that mistake before in a different vehicle, and the same stands for inside of your garage. You're going to smell it all the time, and it's a very pungent smell. So I did end up driving around the block just to make sure everything was good and I didn't run into any issues with the differential. But the real test was whenever I took the vehicle camping over the next weekend. We ended up going up near Mount Baker, taking a few crazy trails up in that location. Probably one of the trails we definitely should have only been in like a small 2-door Jeep, because we ended up scraping the frame, but worked out the differential quite a bit. Didn't have any issues with it, except I did end up smelling the differential fluid. It was a pretty strong smell. I'm guessing it was just getting worked in because there were no leaks, and the breather itself was not leaking, so it wasn't overfilled. I could just smell the fluid. But job was done. Install went great, and I hope you enjoyed watching the video, and thanks for coming to the channel.